What if Prince Harry never truly chose to leave the royal family? What if the decision wasn't a spontaneous rebellion against centuries of tradition, but rather the result of careful, calculated influence from the woman he fell in love with? That's the bombshell suggestion Tom Bower lays on the table. A claim so explosive that, if true, it rewrites the very narrative we've been fed about Megxit. Imagine it. A prince born into one of the most powerful institutions in the world, with duty drilled into him from the cradle, suddenly turning his back on everything. The monarchy, his heritage, his brother, his father, even the memory of his grandmother's life's work. Could this really have been Harry's idea? Or was it something else, something whispered in his ear, night after night, until those whispers became his truth? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. The shocking claim is this: Harry didn't step away because he wanted to. He stepped away because Meghan Markle allegedly made him believe he had no other choice. And here's the thing. Bower says the signs were there from the very beginning. Subtle, almost invisible at first. Tiny seeds planted in the fertile ground of Harry's insecurities. Seeds that would grow, unchecked, into doubt, resentment, and eventually open rebellion against the royal family itself. Now let's pause for a second. Ask yourself this. Have you ever seen someone you care about slowly change before your eyes? Not overnight, but gradually. The way they talk shifts. The way they view the world darkens. Suddenly, people they once trusted become enemies. Friends become strangers. And in the middle of it all, you notice they're clinging tighter to just one person, their so-called rock. Doesn't it make you wonder how much influence one partner can really have? Because that's exactly where this story begins. With influence. With manipulation, if you believe Tom Bower's words. Think about the weight Harry carried even before Meghan arrived. His mother's tragic death. His lifelong struggle with the press. The shadow of his brother William. The heir, the golden boy, always one step ahead. Harry was the spare. Always the spare. A prince without a throne, destined to serve but never to rule. To some, he was the fun-loving rebel. To others, the lost soul. Vulnerable. Searching. And then came Meghan Markle. She wasn't like anyone else he'd known. Glamorous. Outspoken. American. She wasn't intimidated by the palace. She challenged him. Adored him. Stood fiercely by his side. To Harry, she must have felt like oxygen after years of suffocating tradition. But oxygen can also feed a fire. And soon, Bower suggests, the flames began to spread. In their earliest days, Meghan allegedly began hinting at the limits of royal life. That she'd never be fully accepted. That no matter what she did, she would always be less than. Less than Kate. Less than William. Less than the tradition that weighed on her like a chain. And slowly, Harry began to see it too. He began to believe it. Now ask yourself, if your partner insisted again and again that your family didn't value them, how long would it take before you saw things through their eyes? How long before you chose their pain over your loyalty? That's the genius and the danger of influence. It doesn't come with a bang. It comes with a whisper. But this wasn't just about whispers in private rooms. This was about strategy. That's the word Bower uses. Strategy. Meghan, he claims, was already thinking ahead. Already sketching out a future beyond the palace gates. A future of freedom, fame, and financial independence. A future where Harry would no longer be the spare, but the centerpiece of a new royal brand. Picture it. Hollywood power brokers quietly courted. Media allies tested. Narratives crafted. It sounds like the plot of a political thriller. But if Bower is right, it was real. And Harry? He was the key. Without him, Meghan was an actress with ambition. With him, she was a duchess with global reach. Do you see the pattern yet? Doubt. Isolation. Temptation. Each step building on the last. Each move making it harder for Harry to turn back. Until finally, the palace felt like a cage, and Meghan's vision of a glamorous life outside looked like the only way out. But here's the chilling part. According to Bower, Harry may not even realize it happened. He may genuinely believe the decision was his. That's how powerful influence can be. It doesn't force you. It makes you think you chose it yourself. And this is why the story matters right now. Because the cracks in Harry's relationship with the monarchy are permanent. The scars are visible. The bonds severed may never be repaired. And if those choices weren't fully his, what does that mean for his future? What does that mean for the monarchy itself? Consider this. Megxit wasn't just a family drama. It was a constitutional earthquake. The Queen forced to issue an unprecedented statement. The world media on fire. A modern monarchy thrown into crisis. And at the heart of it all, two people insisting they wanted privacy while signing multi-million-dollar deals with Netflix and Spotify. Irony? Contradiction? Or was it always the plan? Let me ask you directly. Do you believe in coincidences? Or do you believe in strategy? Because when you look closely, the timing is almost too perfect. The move to Canada, the sudden shift to Los Angeles, the rapid-fire signing of contracts that must have taken months, if not years, to prepare. Does that sound like two people stumbling into freedom, or like a carefully orchestrated escape? And here's where it gets even darker. Once Harry was committed, there was no way back. The bridges were burned. His brother William was furious. His father Charles was wounded. His grandmother, the Queen, left disappointed. The family bonds that once defined him were shattered, and Meghan was the only one left by his side. Exactly as planned, Bauer suggests. But let's step back. None of this makes Meghan a cartoon villain twirling her mustache. It makes her something far more compelling and far more dangerous in the eyes of the monarchy. A strategist, a woman who knew exactly what she wanted and who convinced the most vulnerable prince in the world to help her get it. And maybe that's why Meghan's defenders get so angry. Because if this version of the story is true, then Harry isn't a rebel prince after all. He's a manipulated one. And that changes everything. Still, the question remains, how did it all begin? What was the very first move in what Tom Bauer describes as a grand strategy? The answer, according to him, lies in a subtle campaign of words. Quiet conversations late at night. Gentle but insistent reminders that the palace didn't see Meghan as an equal. That Harry would always have to choose. That he couldn't have both worlds. And the moment Harry believed that was the moment the seeds of Megxit were planted. But that was only the beginning. Because once doubt took root, temptation followed. And temptation has always been Harry's weakness. The promise of freedom, the allure of California's sunshine, the tantalizing possibility of a life on his own terms. And that, my friends, is where the story takes a darker turn. Because temptation isn't just a dream, it's a weapon. And Meghan allegedly wielded it with precision. What if the first step toward Megxit wasn't a dramatic resignation or public statement? What if it began quietly, behind closed doors, in whispered conversations, late at night, when no one else was listening? That's exactly what Tom Bauer alleges. According to him, Meghan didn't simply marry Harry and hope for the best. She carefully shaped his perception of the royal family from the very beginning. Imagine the scene. A young prince, in love, eager to please, sitting across from his wife. She tells him, gently, that he's constantly being forced to choose between family and her, that the palace will never truly accept her, that the rules, the traditions, the unspoken hierarchy, they are all stacked against them. And day by day, week by week, those words start to seep into his consciousness. Have you ever experienced that kind of subtle influence? Not the shouting or the argument, not the overt pressure, but the quiet insistence that something is wrong around you, that someone you trust is being mistreated, and that you alone can fix it? That's what Bauer claims happened here. Harry began to see his world differently. Family gatherings were no longer cheerful occasions. They became events fraught with tension. Conversations with William or Charles were filtered through Meghan's lens. Suddenly, moments that once seemed harmless, an offhand comment, a protocol reminder, were interpreted as attacks. And isn't it remarkable how perspective can shift? One day, you trust the people closest to you. The next, you see betrayal everywhere. That's what doubt does. It doesn't scream at you. It whispers. It creeps in under the door. And according to Bauer, that's exactly how Meghan operated. Consider this. She reportedly planted the idea that Harry had to choose. That loyalty to the palace was incompatible with loyalty to her. And think about the impact of that framing. The implication wasn't just that Meghan would feel hurt. It was that Harry himself would be morally compromised if he didn't act. He would be failing the person he loved most in the world. Ask yourself, how often do we make decisions not because we believe they are right, but because we fear letting someone else down? Harry was a prince, yes, but he was also human, vulnerable. And for Bower, that vulnerability was exactly the opening Meghan needed. It wasn't just words, either. It was stories, anecdotes, small observations carefully selected to reinforce the message. Meghan would recount subtle slights she allegedly faced, moments when palace staff was supposedly dismissive or condescending. Each story served a purpose: to convince Harry that the institution he had been born into was flawed, that it would never accept them both fully, and that if they wanted peace, they would need to step away. And that is where the psychological groundwork begins. Imagine believing the world around you is subtly conspiring against someone you love. Wouldn't you move heaven and earth to protect them? Wouldn't you consider extreme measures, if necessary, just to shield them? That's the emotional lever that Bower claims Meghan pulled. But it wasn't just about presenting problems. It was also about shaping solutions. If Harry truly believed the royal family was against them, what solution could possibly exist that didn't involve leaving? Suddenly, stepping back from royal duties wasn't rebellion. It was rescue. A noble act. A personal sacrifice. And yet, there's a contradiction here that makes the story even more compelling. Harry had been a royal his entire life. He understood the pressures, the traditions, the media scrutiny. And yet, he was still persuaded. How does someone so experienced fall so completely under influence? The answer, Bower suggests, lies in the cumulative effect of doubt paired with emotional dependence. Every late-night conversation, every subtle hint that the palace was intolerant or unfair, reinforced the idea that Harry's only safe choice was to prioritize Meghan above all else. And according to Bower, this pattern began almost immediately after their engagement. From day one, the narrative was set: the palace versus Meghan, duty versus love, family versus loyalty to her. Now ask yourself, if someone you trusted began framing your life in binary terms, gradually isolating you from your past, how would you react? Could you maintain perspective? Could you resist? Harry, Bower argues, could not. Not because he was weak, but because the influence was expertly timed, emotionally charged, and consistent. And then there were the rumors, the small rumors that grew into bigger ones. The insinuations about staff discontent, the slights that were reported selectively to Harry, the casual mentions of misunderstandings with William or Kate, each carefully chosen to plant a seed of suspicion. Each moment, seemingly innocuous, gradually shaped a perception of betrayal. It's a classic playbook, Bower claims. Plant doubt. Isolate your ally. Make them believe they are the only person who can act. History is filled with examples of influence wielded with subtlety, of individuals convinced to make life-altering decisions not entirely of their own volition. And according to Bower, Megxit fits that pattern perfectly. The result? Harry became increasingly protective, increasingly defensive, and increasingly dependent on Meghan's counsel. The palace was no longer just a family institution. It had become a pressure cooker, a place of stress, misunderstanding, and perceived betrayal. Each visit, each public appearance, each interaction with staff reinforced the narrative Meghan had allegedly begun constructing from day one. And what's striking here is how emotional the stakes were. This wasn't just about protocol or duty. This was about love. And love is powerful. It can cloud judgment. It can distort reality. And in this case, Bower suggests, it did exactly that. Harry's loyalty to Meghan made him see the world through a new, filtered lens, one that magnified threats, minimized positives, and left him increasingly convinced that stepping away was the only rational choice. But here's the twist. According to Bower, the planting of doubt was only step one. Because doubt alone doesn't cause someone to leave a royal life. It's uncomfortable, yes, but not enough to sever centuries of tradition. No, for that, you need another element, temptation, a vision of something better, something freer, something more glamorous and independent than the palace could ever provide. And that, Bower claims, was coming next. But for now, the seeds of doubt had done their work. Harry was increasingly convinced that he was protecting the woman he loved, that staying in the palace would be an act of betrayal, that leaving wasn't rebellion, it was salvation. And as any strategist knows, once your target begins to see the world through the lens you've carefully constructed, the next move is easy. You've weakened their defenses, you've guided their perception, and you've made them believe that the choice they are about to make is entirely their own. So ask yourself again, was Megxit truly Harry's decision? Or was it, as Bower claims, the inevitable outcome of a carefully orchestrated influence campaign, one that began quietly, subtly, in the earliest days of their marriage? And just when Harry thought he was acting out of love, out of protection, and out of loyalty to Meghan, the stage was being set for the next phase, the temptation of Hollywood, the allure of freedom, the promises of a life beyond the palace gates. But what happened next would escalate the stakes even further. Doubt had been planted, trust had shifted, and now, the first hints of temptation were appearing on the horizon. Small, tantalizing, and impossible to ignore. What if leaving the royal family wasn't just about doubt or protection? What if it was also about desire? Not just the desire for freedom, but the kind of allure that makes someone rethink their entire life plan. Tom Bower claims that this was exactly the next step in Meghan's alleged strategy, the Hollywood temptation. Imagine Harry, still reeling from the doubts planted in Chapter 1, suddenly being presented with an irresistible vision. A life where he could be more than a prince living under the constant microscope of tradition. A life where he could explore his identity, his ambitions, and his influence, without rules, without protocol, without the burden of centuries-old expectations. And according to Bower, Meghan was the one holding up that vision like a mirror to a life Harry secretly yearned for. Ask yourself this. How tempting would it be to escape a life that feels constrictive, even if it's gilded? Harry was surrounded by luxury, yes, but that luxury came with constraints. Every move scrutinized, every word dissected, every relationship politicized. And for Meghan, allegedly, the solution was simple. Show him what freedom could look like and make it feel attainable. Bower suggests that Meghan began hinting at the possibilities early on. Subtle mentions of Hollywood connections, casual stories of financial independence, glimpses into a world where their life could be entirely self-directed. Each anecdote carefully designed to make stepping away from the palace not just appealing, but inevitable. And here's the kicker. Harry, according to Bower, didn't just buy into it. He began to believe it was his path to empowerment. Suddenly, the palace wasn't a place of privilege, but a cage. Every protocol, every duty, every royal engagement became a chain he wanted to break. And the promise of freedom, championed by Meghan, became the key to unlocking it. But it wasn't just abstract freedom. Bower claims Meghan painted a very specific picture, a life of influence and visibility on the world stage. Imagine being a prince who has spent decades in your brother's shadow, now offered the chance to be a global figure on your own terms. The contrast is stark. From ceremonial appearances and formal events to starring in media deals, documentaries, and charitable initiatives with unlimited creative control. The temptation was concrete, compelling, and irresistible. Ask yourself, would you ignore such an offer? When every day in your current life feels like a performance with invisible strings, isn't the idea of cutting those strings almost intoxicating? And that's exactly what Bower argues Meghan did. She didn't just seed doubt. She dangled a lifeline, a vision of autonomy that seemed just within reach. Then there's the emotional manipulation. Bower claims that Meghan allegedly reinforced the narrative of being trapped, often juxtaposed with the freedom they could achieve together. She reportedly suggested that the palace would never fully accept her, that they would always be marginalized, and that Harry's only recourse was to leave, and that leaving wasn't just preferable, it was moral. Suddenly, the glamorous promises of Hollywood weren't just tempting, they were framed as the right thing to do. And let's not forget the timing. Bower emphasizes that these conversations didn't happen in isolation. They were threaded through daily life. a mention of a successful actress or a Hollywood party, a story about a celebrity couple navigating fame on their own terms. These weren't just random anecdotes. They were part of a carefully curated narrative to normalize the idea of leaving the palace. It's fascinating, isn't it, how the human mind responds to contrast. On one side, the palace, tradition, scrutiny, limitation. On the other, Hollywood, autonomy, influence. The closer the fantasy feels, the more it shapes perception, especially when the alternative is portrayed as a trap. That, Bauer argues, was Meghan's genius. She made the fantasy tangible and the palace stifling. And Harry, still loyal but increasingly anxious, was the perfect audience. And then there's the emotional spike. Bauer reports that Meghan allegedly framed every suggestion of stepping away as an act of love, of protection, of partnership. She didn't just say, "We could be free." She said, implicitly, "We should be free, for us, for our future, for the love we share." And when you combine emotional leverage with strategic vision, you've created a potent formula for decision-making, one that bypasses reason and appeals directly to loyalty and desire. But here's the contradiction that makes this story so gripping. Harry had always been a prince in the public eye. He knew the consequences of stepping away. He knew the scrutiny, the backlash, the family tension that would follow. And yet, according to Bauer, the allure of freedom was framed so persuasively that it eclipsed these risks. The dream was more vivid than reality, the temptation more powerful than duty. Ask yourself, have you ever faced a choice between security and possibility? Between obligation and desire? Between what you know and what you hope for? Harry's situation was the ultimate version of that dilemma. And according to Bauer, Meghan allegedly guided him to choose desire, not obligation. And it didn't stop at daydreams. Bauer claims that Meghan allegedly began preparing tangible paths for their exit. Contacts were reportedly lined up. Hollywood insiders, media executives, and potential partners were engaged quietly in the background. The suggestion is that when Harry finally agreed to step back, the mechanisms to make it happen were already in place. This wasn't spontaneous. It was meticulously orchestrated. The emotional stakes intensified when Harry began to see himself as an agent of change. By leaving, he could be more than a prince constrained by rules. He could be a man shaping his own narrative, empowered by love, and accompanied by the person who had convinced him that stepping away was the right choice. Bauer paints this as a combination of love and strategy, persuasion and ambition. But let's pause. If what Bauer alleges is true, there's a deeper irony here. Meghan sold the vision of freedom as independence, yet it required Harry's complete devotion. The narrative of stepping away for liberation was entwined with dependence. He was free, yes, but only through alignment with her plan. The paradox is sharp: autonomy achieved through influence, liberation through direction. And just when the stakes were peaking, Bauer claims the next phase began, creating tension with the palace staff, the subtle provocations, and the small, staged confrontations designed to reinforce Harry's perception that staying in the royal fold was untenable. The Hollywood temptation alone wasn't enough. It had to be paired with a growing sense of siege and the perception that the world outside was brighter, freer, and safer. And that's where the tension escalates. Doubt had been planted. Temptation had been dangled. The stage was set. But the next moves, confrontations, isolation, strategic planning, would push Harry closer and closer to a decision from which there was no turning back. So ask yourself, if someone you trusted built a vision of freedom so seductive, combined with constant reminders that the world you came from was hostile, could you resist? How much influence does love have over choice? How far would you go to protect someone you love while pursuing a dream painted by their hand? The answers, according to Bauer, were coming into focus. But what happened next would make doubt and temptation feel like child's play compared to the psychological pressure Harry faced as the palace began to feel like a cage, and Meghan allegedly positioned herself as the only safe harbor. And just when you think the story couldn't get more intense, the next chapter reveals the confrontations, the stage clashes, and the carefully curated chaos that would escalate everything toward the ultimate break from the royal family. What if the next phase of Megxit wasn't just about temptation or whispers of doubt, but about conflict? Not random arguments or everyday misunderstandings, but carefully timed confrontations that would make Harry question everything he thought he knew about the palace and about himself. That's exactly what Tom Bower alleges happened. According to him, Meghan didn't just influence Harry quietly. She allegedly created tension, staged disputes, and manipulated staff interactions in a way that made Harry feel like he had no choice but to protect her. Picture the scene. Palace corridors buzzing with aides, secretaries, and officials moving silently behind the scenes. A small disagreement over protocol. A suggestion that Harry attend an event he'd rather skip. A casual comment about Meghan's schedule. Each of these moments, Bower claims, was subtly framed, or sometimes exaggerated, to appear as an attack. And when Harry witnessed his wife allegedly being challenged, criticized, or dismissed, he felt compelled to defend her, sometimes publicly, sometimes in private. Ask yourself, how often do we see an argument and immediately take one side, even before knowing the full story? How often does loyalty make us blind to nuance? Harry, Bower suggests, was increasingly caught in that very dynamic. He saw Meghan as under siege, and in turn, the palace became the enemy. And that's where the strategy allegedly becomes sophisticated. These weren't just ordinary workplace disputes. They were small, calculated friction points designed to make Harry see the palace as an oppressive force. According to Bower, Meghan allegedly pushed boundaries with staff repeatedly, questioning traditions, challenging protocols, sometimes outright ignoring established procedures. Each clash created a ripple effect, tension, stress, and, most importantly, a narrative of us versus them. And here's the dramatic twist. Staff reportedly grew frustrated. Some even whispered about Meghan being difficult or demanding. But Harry, increasingly loyal to Meghan, interpreted these frustrations as confirmation that the palace was unfair, biased, and incapable of understanding his wife. What outsiders saw as minor disputes, Harry allegedly saw as systemic attacks. Imagine living in that world. Every day a minefield. Every interaction a test of loyalty. Every disagreement not just a conflict, but a threat. And at the center of it all, the woman he loved, supposedly targeted, needing rescue. It's a high-stakes emotional pressure cooker. Bower claims that this dynamic created an environment where Harry began to believe that leaving wasn't just an option, it was a moral imperative. And let's not underestimate the psychological impact. Repeated exposure to conflict, especially when combined with emotional appeals, can distort perception. Minor incidents seem monumental. Routine criticisms feel like attacks. Allegiance to one person becomes the only anchor in a chaotic world. That, Bower suggests, was precisely the trap Meghan allegedly set. Ask yourself, have you ever witnessed a relationship where someone seems constantly embattled, yet completely convinced of their righteousness? How often does the observer question their own reality under that influence? Harry was reportedly living inside a narrative carefully curated to make him feel that the palace and its traditions were obstacles to justice, love, and family loyalty. And it wasn't just confrontations with staff. According to Bower, Meghan allegedly created moments where Harry felt personally attacked. Protocol reminders, criticism of appearances, even subtle press leaks that painted their interactions in a negative light. Each incident reinforced the perception that the royal family and their machinery were working against them. Harry's protective instincts were fired up, and with each escalation, the psychological walls around him grew thicker. Consider the irony. Harry, a man who had been trained for public life from childhood, suddenly found himself increasingly isolated, defending his wife against what seemed like endless minor skirmishes. Yet from the outside, these events might have appeared trivial or petty. To Harry, they were evidence of a system he could no longer trust. And Bower claims Meghan leveraged this perception masterfully. And the contradictions pile up. Harry wanted peace. He wanted family harmony. Yet the very actions intended to protect his wife made the palace feel unsafe, unfamiliar, and, crucially, incompatible with their happiness. The same palace that had raised him now seemed the adversary, and the only alternative offered was stepping away. It's important to note that Bauer doesn't suggest this was overt manipulation in the sense of public confrontations or grand declarations. It was subtle, psychological, emotional, a quiet campaign of stress and pressure, combined with the narrative of we against the world, designed to make Harry dependent on Meghan's guidance and perspective. And here's the tipping point. Once isolation and confrontation merged, leaving the palace became not just desirable, but necessary. Harry, Bauer alleges, began to internalize the idea that the family he was born into was no longer compatible with the woman he loved. Every clash, every critique, every minor protocol breach became proof that the system couldn't coexist with their vision of life together. Ask yourself this. When someone you love repeatedly points out flaws in the environment you were raised to trust, do you see truth or distortion? How easily can doubt grow into conviction when reinforced daily by conflict? Bauer's narrative suggests that Harry reached a point where he saw only two paths: continue defending Meghan in a palace system he now viewed as hostile, or step away entirely and reclaim control of his life. It's important to note that Bauer doesn't suggest this was overt manipulation in the sense of public confrontations or grand declarations. It was subtle, psychological, emotional, a quiet campaign of stress and pressure, combined with a narrative of we against the world, designed to make Harry dependent on Meghan's guidance and perspective. And here's the tipping point. Once isolation and confrontation merged, leaving the palace became not just desirable, but necessary. Harry, Bauer alleges, began to internalize the idea that the family he was born into was no longer compatible with the woman he loved. Every clash, every critique, every minor protocol breach became proof that the system couldn't coexist with their vision of life together. Ask yourself this. When someone you love repeatedly points out flaws in the environment you were raised to trust, do you see truth or distortion? How easily can doubt grow into conviction when reinforced daily by conflict? Bauer's narrative suggests that Harry reached a point where he saw only two paths: continue defending Meghan in a palace system he now viewed as hostile, or step away entirely and reclaim control of his life. And it's here, Bauer claims, that Meghan's alleged influence reaches its peak in this phase. She positioned herself as the only ally Harry could trust. The palace was framed as a place of tension and betrayal. Staff were cast as antagonists. Minor disputes were magnified into systemic issues. And Harry, already emotionally invested and increasingly isolated, was guided into believing that leaving wasn't rebellion. It was protection, loyalty, and love. But the staff wars weren't the final piece of the puzzle. Conflict alone doesn't break centuries of tradition. Doubt alone doesn't compel a prince to resign. Temptation alone isn't enough without pressure. And now, according to Bauer, the isolation strategy was about to kick in, a phase even more subtle, more insidious, and more effective than any clash or confrontation. Isolation doesn't mean cutting someone off physically. It's about emotional geography. It's about reshaping who a person turns to for guidance, for comfort, for truth. Bauer claims Meghan allegedly began distancing Harry from William, Kate, and even Charles, making herself his primary confidant. And when the world narrows to a single trusted ally, leaving the entire palace system suddenly feels like the only rational choice. So ask yourself, if the people you've always turned to for guidance start to feel like strangers, while one voice grows louder, more convincing, and more aligned with your emotions, how difficult is it to resist their influence? That's the psychological lever that Bauer alleges Meghan pulled masterfully. And just when you think it couldn't get more intense, the next chapter reveals the isolation strategy in full, how Harry was allegedly nudged away from his family, made dependent on Meghan, and gradually convinced that the palace was no longer his home. But what came next would push him closer to the ultimate step, stepping away entirely, signing contracts, and committing to a life outside the monarchy. The isolation was almost complete, and the stage was being set for the next irreversible act. What if the most powerful influence isn't loud or obvious, but quiet, relentless, and almost invisible? That's what Tom Bauer alleges happened next in the saga of Megxit. After planting doubt and dangling the Hollywood temptation, Meghan allegedly executed the most critical phase of her alleged strategy, isolation. By subtly cutting Harry off from the very people who had shaped his life, his brother, his sister-in-law, even his father, she positioned herself as the only anchor he could trust. Imagine the psychology of isolation. When your world narrows to a single confidant, your perception of reality shifts. Nuance disappears. Outside perspectives feel threatening. Criticism becomes conspiracy. And every decision you make becomes filtered through the lens of the one person you trust most. According to Bauer, this was exactly the position Meghan allegedly sought to create with Harry. The process, Bauer claims, began subtly. Family dinners that were once routine became uncomfortable. Invitations were declined or delayed. Harry's time with William and Kate became sporadic, each encounter tinged with tension. Minor disagreements that might once have been shrugged off were now amplified. Every interaction with family members was reframed as evidence of disapproval or misunderstanding. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Harry began to rely more on Meghan for guidance, validation, and reassurance. Ask yourself, have you ever felt isolated without even realizing it? The people you once leaned on begin to drift away, often for reasons outside your control, while one person seems to occupy more and more of your attention and trust. The isolation itself feels natural, even necessary. That's the power of influence. Bauer argues that Meghan allegedly orchestrated this very dynamic. And it wasn't just physical separation. It was emotional and informational. Bauer claims Meghan allegedly controlled the narrative, carefully framing events, conversations, and even media coverage to make Harry feel the palace was antagonistic, inflexible, and unsupportive. Every minor criticism became proof that leaving was the only viable path. Every suggestion of compromise was reframed as a threat to their autonomy. And Harry, emotionally invested and already primed by doubt, internalized these interpretations. The isolation strategy also involved the slow erosion of alternative perspectives. Friends, advisors, and family who might have challenged Meghan's version of events were gradually marginalized. Meetings were postponed. Calls went unanswered. Trusted voices were either discredited subtly or framed as misinformed. Bauer suggests that by the time Harry fully internalized the idea that leaving was necessary, he had very few people left to offer counterbalance. And this is where the stakes became truly personal. Isolation magnifies influence not just by narrowing options, but by amplifying emotions. Harry was not only physically and socially constrained, but emotionally tethered to Meghan. Every decision became a question of loyalty, every action a test of love. According to Bauer, this dynamic made stepping away from the palace feel less like rebellion and more like protection. Ask yourself, how would you feel if you believed that your family, your community, and your closest allies were all aligned against someone you loved deeply? How far would you go to safeguard that person, even if it meant abandoning traditions, expectations, or responsibilities you once held sacred? Harry, Bauer suggests, faced exactly this dilemma. The strategy was also reinforced by external pressures. Media coverage, public commentary, and even leaks were allegedly leveraged to make isolation feel urgent and necessary. Bauer claims that narratives portraying Meghan as misunderstood or unfairly treated fed into Harry's growing perception that the palace environment was toxic. Each article, each rumor, each seemingly random media mention became another brick in the wall separating him from his family. And here's the crucial point. Isolation alone doesn't compel a person to leave a life they've known their entire existence. What makes it effective is timing, emotional intensity, and cumulative pressure. According to Bauer, Meghan allegedly combined all three elements with precision. Doubt had been planted. Temptation had been offered. Now, isolation ensured that Harry would see no viable alternative but to follow the path she had laid out. Consider the emotional cost. Isolation can be disorienting. It magnifies insecurities, heightens fear, and skews judgment. Bauer argues that by the time Harry reached this stage, he was increasingly dependent on Meghan not just for companionship, but for interpretation of reality itself. She became the lens through which he viewed the palace, the media, and even his own choices. And yet, Isolation also deepens commitment. When a person is removed from alternative perspectives, the influence of the trusted confidant grows exponentially. Every suggestion, every plan, every vision presented by Meghan became not just persuasive, but authoritative. According to Bauer, this is precisely why the move toward Megxit was inevitable once the isolation phase had taken hold. Ask yourself, if your world narrowed to a single trusted ally and every argument, disagreement, or challenge reinforced the need to listen only to that person, how much control would you actually have over your decisions? Bauer claims that Harry's autonomy, in this critical period, was increasingly shaped by Meghan's strategic guidance. And just when you think the pressure couldn't get more intense, Bauer alleges that Meghan's preparation for the next phase, the move to independence and the launch of their media empire, was already in motion. Contacts, contracts, and negotiations were quietly arranged behind the scenes. The vision she had been painting for years was ready to become reality. Harry, emotionally dependent and increasingly convinced of the necessity of stepping away, was now poised to take the final leap. But isolation, Bauer argues, was the linchpin. Without it, doubt and temptation might have remained theoretical. Without it, the conflicts with staff might have been manageable. Without it, Harry might have resisted. Isolation ensured that stepping away didn't feel like abandoning family or duty. It felt like survival, loyalty, and love. And just when the audience thinks the story has reached its apex, the next chapter reveals how Meghan allegedly transitioned from influencing Harry emotionally to executing the material side of their escape. Deals were signed. Contracts were prepared. Hollywood doors opened. The stage was set for Netflix, Spotify, and a life entirely on their terms. But what happened next would transform influence into action and rumors into global headlines. Harry's leap into independence wasn't just an emotional decision anymore. It became a business strategy, a personal manifesto, and a public spectacle all at once. What if leaving the royal family wasn't just about love, doubt, or isolation, but also about opportunity? Tom Bauer alleges that Meghan Markle didn't merely influence Harry emotionally. She allegedly had a master plan for turning their exit into a launchpad for global visibility, financial independence, and Hollywood influence. The Netflix and Spotify deals weren't accidental. According to Bauer, they were the culmination of years of preparation, carefully timed to coincide with Harry's step back from royal life. Imagine the stakes. A young prince, fresh from the public drama of Megxit, suddenly holding the keys to a multi-billion-dollar media empire. The allure is undeniable, but Bauer suggests that this was no coincidence. The deals were reportedly in development long before the official announcement, signaling that the exit wasn't merely reactive, it was premeditated. Meghan, Bauer claims, allegedly lined up Hollywood contacts, media executives, and potential collaborators in advance, ensuring that the moment Harry agreed to step back, they could immediately capitalize on it. Ask yourself, how much planning would it take to execute an escape from a life defined by centuries of tradition and simultaneously position yourself for maximum opportunity in a completely different arena? Bauer argues that Meghan allegedly handled it with meticulous precision. Every introduction, every call, every behind-the-scenes meeting was timed to coincide with Harry's emotional readiness to step away. And it wasn't just about money. These deals were symbolic. Netflix represented visibility and narrative control. Spotify offered voice, influence, and the ability to shape their public image on their own terms. Bauer claims that Meghan allegedly framed these opportunities to Harry as extensions of freedom, proof that leaving the palace wasn't just morally right, it was strategically wise. Consider the psychology. Harry had been isolated, confronted with conflict, tempted with a vision of Hollywood freedom. Now the fantasy had a concrete, actionable path. It wasn't abstract anymore. The contracts, the potential audiences, and the global impact made leaving the monarchy feel like stepping into a pre-prepared destiny. Bauer suggests that this final step made the decision feel both urgent and inevitable. And the emotional stakes were enormous. According to Bauer, Meghan allegedly presented these deals as more than business moves. They were framed as joint ventures, acts of partnership, and expressions of their shared vision for a new life. Harry's loyalty, love, and trust in Meghan transformed professional opportunity into personal obligation. Accepting the deals wasn't just a career choice. It was an affirmation of the life she had guided him towards since the beginning of their marriage. Ask yourself, have you ever made a life-altering decision not just because it seemed right, but because the path was made irresistible by someone you trusted? That's the tension Bauer alleges existed. The deals weren't dangling in the air. They were carefully engineered incentives that made stepping away feel not just logical, but necessary. And it wasn't without risk. Netflix and Spotify were highly public ventures. Bauer emphasizes that the visibility of these deals meant that Harry and Meghan's exit from the palace would be under scrutiny like never before. The stakes were massive, but the timing, strategy, and preparation minimized risk and maximized impact. According to Bauer, Meghan allegedly understood this and ensured every step was calculated. It's also important to consider the irony. The very media machine that once scrutinized every move now became a tool for autonomy. The press, public perception, and celebrity culture that had previously constrained Harry were now part of the leverage Meghan allegedly used to turn Megxit into a personal and financial springboard. Bauer claims she didn't just react to opportunities, she manufactured them. And the contracts themselves were reportedly structured to reinforce independence. Creative control, ownership, and long-term strategic positioning were allegedly non-negotiable. This wasn't just a payday. It was the foundation for an entirely self-directed life. Bauer argues that Harry, already emotionally invested and increasingly reliant on Meghan's guidance, embraced the deals as the tangible proof that leaving the monarchy was the right choice. Ask yourself, how often does an opportunity arrive exactly when emotional readiness, personal influence, and long-term strategy converge? According to Bauer, this was no accident. Meghan allegedly orchestrated the alignment of emotional influence and strategic timing with the precision of a seasoned operator. And then there's the public narrative. Bauer emphasizes that the Netflix and Spotify announcements were timed to coincide with global attention on Megxit, turning what could have been a quiet personal transition into a highly visible, influential event. The world watched as Harry and Meghan took the stage, positioned as independent, empowered, and forward-looking, reinforcing the story Meghan had allegedly been crafting for years. The emotional impact on Harry was profound. According to Bauer, the deals validated his decision to leave. They made the leap from the royal family feel not just right, but necessary. Doubt, temptation, confrontation, isolation. They all culminated in a concrete, powerful demonstration of what freedom and partnership could achieve. But there's a deeper irony, Bauer suggests. While the deals represented independence, they also solidified dependence on media, on public perception, and on Meghan's strategic vision. Harry's freedom came at the cost of absolute trust in the one person who had guided every step of the journey. Independence, paradoxically, required alignment with a meticulously planned roadmap. And just when the world thought the story had reached its peak, Bauer claims there were still layers to uncover. Legal preparations, financial planning, and private negotiations that ensured Harry and Meghan's exit was irreversible. The deals weren't just opportunities. They were guarantees that stepping away wasn't reversible, making every prior influence, every confrontation, every moment of isolation, a necessary prelude to action. Ask yourself, if you were presented with a life-altering opportunity carefully crafted by someone you trusted, would you hesitate? Or would you step forward, believing that every prior moment had led you to this exact juncture? According to Bauer, Harry's decision to embrace Netflix and Spotify was the culmination of years of influence, preparation, and psychological pressure, all allegedly orchestrated by Meghan. But the story doesn't end with signed contracts and headlines. The next phase, Bauer alleges, involves the ripple effects of these deals, strained family relationships, global scrutiny, and the enduring question of agency. How much of Harry's choice was truly his own? And how much was the product of years of influence, manipulation, and strategic foresight? And just when you think the stage couldn't be set any higher, the next chapter explores the aftermath, the global reaction, the family fallout, and the internal consequences of Megxit, revealing the emotional, political, and psychological consequences of a decision that was years in the making. What happens when a royal decision shocks the world? When centuries of tradition collide with modern ambitions? According to Tom Bauer, the fallout from Megxit was swift, seismic, and far-reaching. Harry and Meghan had stepped away from royal duties, signed multi-million-dollar deals, and launched themselves into global visibility. But the personal, familial, and political consequences were just beginning to ripple outward. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing the life you've known forever has irrevocably changed, not just for you, but for everyone around you. That, Bauer claims, was the immediate reality for Harry. The decision to leave wasn't just a headline. It was a rupture that reverberated through the palace, the media, and public perception. Family members, who had been allies, critics, or neutral observers, suddenly became central figures in a story of conflict, betrayal, and choice. And the public reaction? Explosive. According to Bauer, the moment the announcement went live, media outlets around the world framed the exit in sensational terms. The palace's restraint contrasted sharply with the couple's bold, public-facing messaging. Headlines emphasized division, independence, and rebellion. Social media erupted, and public opinion became a battleground. For Harry, Bauer suggests, the global scrutiny magnified the pressure he already felt, creating a feedback loop where criticism reinforced the narrative that leaving was necessary. Ask yourself, how would you respond if every action you took was scrutinized by millions? If every decision, every word, every gesture was dissected endlessly? Harry, according to Bauer, faced that reality instantly. The fallout was not only public, but deeply personal. Friends, advisors, and distant family members reacted in ways that ranged from shock to anger, often amplifying feelings of isolation and dependence that Meghan allegedly cultivated. And the internal palace reaction was equally intense. Bauer claims that senior royals were blindsided, feeling both betrayed and cornered. Meetings, private discussions, and attempts at reconciliation reportedly occurred behind closed doors, but the dynamics were strained. Every effort to mediate or negotiate was complicated by the public nature of the exit and the timing of the Netflix and Spotify deals. Harry was caught between loyalty to his family and allegiance to Meghan. A tension Bauer suggests was exacerbated by years of influence and psychological preparation. But it wasn't just emotional fallout. Bauer reports that operationally, the exit created chaos. Security arrangements, schedules, financial responsibilities, and charitable obligations all had to be restructured. Advisors scrambled to adapt, staff were reassigned, and protocols rewritten. For Harry and Meghan, the stress of stepping into independence was immediate and tangible. The glamorous vision of freedom met the harsh realities of autonomy, and the contrast was stark. Ask yourself, have you ever made a major life change only to discover that freedom comes with responsibilities you hadn't anticipated? That, according to Bauer, is exactly what Harry faced. The emotional journey of Megxit collided with the practical consequences, creating tension, doubt, and occasional regret. The fallout also extended to relationships. Bauer claims that Harry's bond with William became increasingly strained. Private conversations reportedly grew terse, and family gatherings were fraught with unspoken tension. Kate and Charles, once pillars of support, were now seen through a lens of conflict, judgment, and perceived hostility. Every interaction reinforced Harry's perception of separation, making the isolation Meghan allegedly engineered feel permanent. And yet, public perception added a new layer. Supporters praised Harry and Meghan for bravery and independence. Critics condemned them for abandoning duty, tradition, and family. Bauer emphasizes that this duality created cognitive dissonance. The couple felt both empowered and vilified simultaneously, a paradox that increased stress while reinforcing the narrative that stepping away had been necessary to preserve their integrity and freedom. Ask yourself, how do you navigate a world where every action is polarizing, every choice dissected, and every ally potentially an opponent? Harry, Bauer claims, navigated it by leaning on Meghan, increasingly viewing her guidance as essential to interpreting reality. The isolation, temptation, and conflicts of earlier chapters now fully converged, shaping perception and decision-making in profound ways. The fallout was also financial and strategic. The deals with Netflix and Spotify, while lucrative, came with obligations and scrutiny. Bauer suggests that Meghan allegedly managed these arrangements, ensuring that the couple's independence was financially sustainable, but also highly visible. This visibility amplified both opportunity and criticism, creating a pressure cooker environment where every misstep became public fodder. And the emotional cost. Bauer reports that Harry experienced feelings of guilt, conflict, and stress. He had left the monarchy, potentially alienated family, and stepped into a high-stakes media environment, all under global scrutiny. Yet, according to Bauer, the influence Meghan had over him made him view these challenges as necessary sacrifices. Love, loyalty, and trust intertwined with ambition, creating a complex psychological landscape that few could navigate. Ask yourself, when you make a decision that affects not just yourself but your family, career, and legacy, how do you reconcile the exhilaration of independence with the weight of consequence? For Harry, Bauer argues, this tension was constant and consuming. Every day was a negotiation between freedom and responsibility, ambition and loyalty, public perception and private reality. And just when it seemed the fallout had peaked, Bauer claims another twist emerged. The global media frenzy, amplified by social media, created a feedback loop of perception, criticism, and reaction that further solidified the couple's departure. Isolation, temptation, and strategic planning all converged, and the decision to leave became not just inevitable, but irreversible. But the most dramatic consequences were still unfolding behind closed doors. The next chapter, Bauer alleges, reveals how Harry and Meghan navigated these pressures, adapted to their new independent life, and faced the personal and relational ramifications that no deal, no contract, and no strategic plan could fully prepare them for. The fallout had begun, but what came next would test the very foundation of loyalty, trust, and ambition, forcing Harry to confront the realities of a life shaped by influence, love, and global attention in ways he may never have anticipated. What happens when personal decisions ripple outward, creating tensions that once seemed unimaginable? According to Tom Bauer, the decision to step away from the royal family didn't just make headlines. It allegedly tore open cracks in relationships that had been forged over decades. Harry's bond with William, Kate, and even Charles was under unprecedented strain. What began as subtle disagreements escalated into something far more consequential, a rift that would redefine the royal family dynamic. Imagine the emotional complexity. Harry had always relied on his family for guidance, companionship, and a sense of identity. But once Meghan allegedly orchestrated doubt, temptation, and isolation, every interaction with William or Charles carried an undercurrent of tension. Bauer claims that these relationships, once close, were now marked by mistrust, unspoken resentments, and conflicting loyalties. Every conversation, every public appearance, every private gesture became a test of allegiance. Ask yourself, how does a relationship survive when one party feels manipulated or misunderstood, while the other feels isolated and defensive? For Harry and William, Bauer suggests, the answers were elusive. Arguments reportedly erupted over what outsiders might have perceived as minor issues. But in reality, they were flashpoints reflecting deeper fractures. One small disagreement could escalate because of years of accumulated doubt and tension, making reconciliation increasingly difficult. And it wasn't just about Harry's relationship with his brother. Bauer alleges that Meghan's influence also affected interactions with Charles and Kate. The isolation strategy had positioned Meghan as Harry's primary confidant, and any attempt to involve other family members in discussions could be framed, subtly or overtly, as interference or misunderstanding. According to Bauer, this dynamic pushed Harry further toward dependency on Meghan and away from his family. The emotional stakes were enormous. Imagine the internal conflict of wanting to maintain family ties while also defending a partner who has allegedly positioned you against them. Bauer claims Harry was caught in this emotional tug-of-war, feeling guilty for perceived betrayals yet convinced that stepping away was necessary for his and Meghan's well-being. Each family interaction became an emotional minefield. Ask yourself, if someone you love frames loyalty in such a way that your closest relationships feel like obstacles, how do you choose? How do you balance love, duty, and personal conviction? According to Bauer, these were questions Harry wrestled with daily, and the public dimension compounded the stress. Every media report, every headline, every social media post about family tension amplified private strain. Public perception became a magnifying glass, turning what might have been solvable disagreements into symbolic battles representing loyalty, independence, and identity. Harry and Meghan were not just navigating personal choices, they were performing them on a global stage. The rift deepened further as family events and engagements became fraught. Bauer claims that invitations to gatherings were delayed, declined, or complicated by scheduling conflicts. Misunderstandings multiplied. Every absence or refusal to participate in tradition was interpreted by some as betrayal, by others as justified independence. The resulting tension became a feedback loop. The more Harry stepped away, the more distance grew between him and his family, reinforcing Meghan's alleged narrative that the palace was hostile or unaccepting. And it wasn't only family members who felt the strain. Advisors, staff, and close friends found themselves caught between loyalty to tradition and support for Harry's new path. Bauer suggests that Meghan allegedly orchestrated these dynamics carefully, ensuring that Harry's network of support outside the palace aligned with her vision of independence. Those who could challenge her influence were gradually marginalized, while those who reinforced her narrative became trusted allies. Ask yourself, when your environment shifts so dramatically, when alliances and loyalties are constantly in flux, how do you determine what is real and what is manipulation? According to Bauer, Harry faced this dilemma every day, with the rift between him and his family growing even as he pursued a life of independence. And the emotional weight, immense. Bauer claims Harry experienced guilt, sadness, and doubt as he navigated the widening chasm. Every personal choice, every contract, every media appearance, every public statement carried the burden of potentially widening the family divide. At the same time, the isolation and influence Meghan allegedly wielded reinforced the narrative that leaving was not just preferable, but morally right. The irony, Bauer points out, is stark. Independence came at the cost of intimacy. Freedom was inseparable from tension. And the very strategies that facilitated stepping away, temptation, confrontation, isolation, also ensured that reconciliation became increasingly unlikely. The rift wasn't just emotional. It was structural, psychological, and public. And just when the audience might think the story couldn't get more fraught, Bauer alleges an additional layer: private communications, unshared details, and subtle maneuvering behind the scenes further fueled mistrust. Every email, phone call, or unannounced meeting became a potential flashpoint. Harry's choices, already complicated by love, duty, and ambition, now had to navigate a labyrinth of family expectations, media scrutiny, and strategic counsel. Ask yourself, when relationships are under siege, when trust is strained, and when every action is magnified publicly, how do you decide who to believe, who to trust, and how to act? According to Bauer, Harry's dependency on Meghan had reached a point where alternative perspectives were increasingly difficult to integrate. The family rift wasn't just a consequence of stepping away. It was part of the orchestrated path that led him to independence. And as the chapter closes, the tension is at its peak. The family rift has widened. Public scrutiny is relentless. Emotional stakes are sky high. And Bauer hints that what comes next will test the couple's resilience, the durability of their partnerships, and the consequences of a life defined by influence, strategy, and relentless public exposure. What happens when loyalty, love, and ambition collide in a world where every choice is magnified and every misstep broadcast to millions? The next chapter promises answers and a twist that no one saw coming. What happens when private decisions become public spectacle? According to Tom Bauer, once Harry and Meghan stepped away from the royal family, The media frenzy intensified in ways that were both predictable and shocking. Headlines, opinion pieces, social media storms, everything combined into a relentless blitz that magnified every decision, scrutinized every interaction, and fueled global debate. This wasn't merely public interest. It was an orchestrated theater of attention, and Bauer claims Meghan allegedly knew exactly how to navigate it. The media, Bauer reports, became both a battlefield and a tool. Every move by the couple was analyzed, dissected, and sensationalized. Tabloids ran with headlines implying betrayal, rebellion, and personal failure. Commentators debated whether Harry had been manipulated or whether Meghan had overstepped. Social media exploded, creating echo chambers of support and condemnation. According to Bauer, this